long past and a fractious, ugly election as part of a new dawn for the United States. We're not here to talk about villains, but she provides a useful example of how poetry crafts our vision of the
Cool. Uh-oh. Technology is fun. All right, public memory, how a society or a collective constructs a shared understanding of their past, and we use it to understand where to go in the future. We find public memory in written texts, in things like Hamilton, which redefines the class and racial dynamics of the American Revolution while simultaneously introducing us to characters we may not have known that much about before. We find it in textbooks as the battle over the 1619 project identifies what we learn about the past in school is so important. We build public memory in memorials like those to Vietnam veterans or to Martin Luther King, and we curate it in museums. Hi there, I'm Jennie Keohane. I'm an assistant professor of communication in the Klein Family School of Communications Design at the University of Baltimore. I have a PhD in rhetoric, and I use this rhetorical lens to study public memory. Rhetoric is a fancy word for the strategic use of symbols to accomplish goals. So I'm interested in what's persuasive to an audience in a particular situation. And we can think about persuasion broadly here. It's about identification, about crafting a vision of who we are and what we have in common. Rhetoricians often study what we call memory texts and ask questions like, how do museums and memorials marshal symbols and tell stories and introduce speakers to construct our collective identity and to tell stories about what's important about our past? So I study memory places, museums and memorials, and I've written about the National Museum of American History and how it constructs a vision of a nation as immigrants and entrepreneurs. We're going to come back to that. I've also studied how the exhibit in this museum called The First Ladies limits the power of how we remember First Ladies by grounding their memory in inaugural ball gowns and dishes from state dinners. I've also studied the Belmont Hall Women's Equality National Monument to look at how it crafts the story of the suffrage movement, and I'm currently working on a project about the brand new Eisenhower Memorial. Hopefully, I've convinced you that I know some things about public memory, but let's talk about something that I don't know very much about. Poetry. I haven't written a poem since I was in junior high, and I've attended only one other poetry reading in my life, which was for Steven's new book, which we'll hear some more about tonight. But I think if public memory is important to me, then so is poetry. And if public memory is important to you, then so is poetry. Literary critic and rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke described literature as equipment for living, saying that it names recurrent situations and provides strategies for dealing with them. As he says, a different name for snow implies a different kind of hunt, drawing from the example of the Inuit culture and language. So I submit to you that we can see poetry as equipment for living. It goes beyond providing comfort in difficult times, as Moberly Lugar argues. It bears witness, and it adds and forwards political and public discourse, as the Gorman example also illustrates. Maybe, though, we can also see poetry as equipment for remembering tragedy, death, change, and hope. A great example is Gwendolyn Brooks of DeWitt Williams' On the Way to Lincoln Cemetery, a poem that Joseph called my attention to, where Brooks makes a plain Black boy worth remembering. So we're going to use public memory as a lens to understand moments where the past haunts the present, where the present resurrects the past in useful or maybe even problematic ways, and look at those moments where we attribute meaning to the past to make sense of where we are in the present. So public memory then is the lens that we're going to take on these poems and on these poets. It's another way for us to engage their work and to see poets that maybe we wouldn't ordinarily see in conversation together. So If I can provide a thesis for our evening together tonight, it's this. Poetry is one way that we remember and craft narratives about the past. So let's get to the poems. No, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about public memory before we do that. But don't worry, we'll go fast. I'm going to give you 3 quick reasons why I think public memory is important. And the first, to use Benedict Anderson's words, is that it forms our imagined community. It tells us who we are. For example, lost cause narratives of the Confederacy constructed a genteel South fighting to save a chivalric way of life. I don't need to tell you that those narratives are problematic and exclusionary. Likewise, however, the fact that the United States is a nation of immigrants and we're a melting pot also is exclusionary in that it forgets folks who were brought here in conditions of enslavement and people who were here before many of our immigrant ancestors arrived as well. Public memory allows us to take secular but communal pilgrimages, as Kirk Savage writes. We travel to see the memory of our ancestors, which is so often contained in Washington, D.C. The second reason public memory is important, I've hinted at a little bit. It's selective and therefore exclusionary. And it's not just because victors write the first drafts of history, although they do, but it's also because building memory places is expensive, right? We don't have a monument to every single president on the National Mall. Instead, we've identified those presidents that have done things that we see as particularly noteworthy and have had particularly exemplary characters. My analysis of the First Ladies exhibit shows that in this particular exhibit, we present them in what I call a rhetoric of glamour, which is cool, but it diminishes the role that they've played in important events and collapses their entire sort of being to dresses and dishes, which I find problematic in that it constrains our memory of women holding powerful roles. Think as well of the long struggle to fund and construct the National Museum of African American History and Culture as another indication that public memory is exclusionary. There's also, as you may think, or be thinking of, no national museum on the mall to women's history. There is this cute little house, which is really kind of shabby and dingy if you go inside. It's the Belmont Paul House, or the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, and it was dedicated by President Obama in 2016. This house was the headquarters of the National Women's Party, who shepherded the passage of the suffrage amendment and worked for decades to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, ultimately unsuccessfully. You've probably never heard of this house or been to it, especially if you've traveled to Washington, D.C. It's not on the mall, it struggles for funding and is very rarely open because they can't pay enough people to staff it. What's the point? The point is that some stories are displayed more prominently than others in museums. The last reason I'm going to give you for why public memory is important is that it's contested. We debate how events and people should be represented. The Commission on Fine Arts at first didn't approve the design of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the tidal basin because he looked too stern or confrontational, AKA scary for white people. As Sarah Vanderhagen points out, there was another controversy that erupted just weeks before the monument was scheduled to open to the public in 2011, and it was surrounding a quotation that was carved in the monument. The quotation was a paraphrase of a sermon that King had given, saying, "I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness." Many saw this quote as self-aggrandizing and not the true memory of King. So there was a huge debate about who owned and was able to take ownership of the memory of King in this instance. Ultimately, the National Park Service got the chisels back out and changed the quote to the tune of almost $1 million. Likewise, we build countermemorials to recast events when social understanding moves dramatically forward. Unveiled in 2003, the Peace Through Unity Memorial placed at Little Bighorn Battlefield to commemorate the deaths of Indians accompanies monuments to Custer's cavalry as a way to make their lives grievable alongside the lives of his men. You can also think about the reinterpretation work that's happening at Monticello to put the lives of people that Thomas Jefferson enslaved front and center in the story of what happened there, and it's happening at Mount Vernon as well. Now, we've talked mostly about places because that's what I research, but I want to call your attention to one powerful confluence of poetry and place in Emma Lazarus's new Colossus, a poem prominently displayed on a memory place that tells us Americans who we are and sort of forwards that immigrant narrative as well. And it shapes our collective identity, and it's commonly resurrected in debates about just that, immigration. And so I want us to be thinking about places as well where poetry and public memory come together in very visible ways. But so let's talk a little bit more about poetry. I'm going to introduce you to our first poet tonight, and that's Joseph Ross. He's written 4 books of poetry, including most recently Raising King. His poems have also appeared in the LA Times and New York Times Magazine. He won the 2012 Pratt Library Little Patuxent Review Poetry Prize for If Mamie Till Was the Mother of God. He's on the poetry board at the Shakespeare Library around the corner from where I live in DC. And as my neighbor there, he teaches poetry and creative writing. In Raising King, Joseph uses the rhetorical strategy of prosopopoia, or speaking in another's voice, to give us another perspective on the events that he's memorializing. In his focus, he pushes us to move beyond I have a dream, which is the dominant remembrance of who King was, and asks us to think about his letter from a Birmingham jail, a touchstone of rhetorical excellence, and his activism on the Vietnam War as well. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everybody here at PCAT. I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to be in Lancaster. Clearly you have a remarkable artist community, and I already knew you have a remarkable poetry community. I'm grateful that Lee is here and Dana, and 2 Danas who are both all superb poets. I'm really glad to be with you. And Steven and Jenny, I really appreciate this opportunity to think about Dr. King, especially through this lens of public memory, because really, in lots of ways, this book, Raising King, is a complete effort at public memory and at kind of trying to recast it to work against what some have called the whitewashing of Dr. King. So we'll get into more of that as we have our discussion, and I really appreciate the ways that Jenny sort of focuses us and sets a context for us, and I hope that will help to spark the conversation we can have after. And I can always hear my friend Randall Horton saying, "Get to the poems." So I'm going to read sort of a quick a quick sort of sketch through some of the events in Raising King, which really moves from Montgomery to Memphis. Martin Luther King Jr. prologue. 1. In the beginning was a boat, swollen with humans history calls slaves. The men who loved these boats thought they knew Jesus. They prayed Jesus. They ate Jesus. Their boat cut the waters like a whip, leaving a weeping scent in its churning wake. The moon lit the water around the boat, but the moon did not light the boat. The boat worked through the waters in the dark. Now the boat is dust. The whip survives. 2. A man came who was not a slave. He was not the moon, its light, or the water. Like the boats before him, he too cut the water, but he was not the whip. He had bones the whip could not reach, but he was not the bones. He had light to cut the darkness, but he was not the light. He met the darkness when the whip became a bullet. The man stood and the bullet came. His bones are dust. The man survives. Dr. King remembers the first day of the Montgomery bus protest. He's a 27-year-old man, new PhD, new husband, new pastor at the Dexter Avenue Church. They had planned and organized, and he remembered the day of days, the first day, December 5th. You plan and call and organize and prepare for every eventuality, but you never know what will come. My wife and I woke earlier than usual, and I was afraid. I was still saying, if we could get 60%, I would be satisfied. In my mind, buses rolled by with Black people atop the bus and hanging from windows, dragging their feet. White men and women filled the bus, laughing, doubled over laughing. What was I thinking would happen? I was in the kitchen whispering over a cup of coffee when I heard Coretta cry, "Martin, Martin, come quickly." I stopped praying and ran into the living room, breathing like an army. A slowly moving bus rolled down our street like a hearse, the casket still years away. Coretta sang into my faithlessness, "Darling, it's empty." I could hardly believe it. Sometimes believing and knowing has to happen at the same time. He remembered mass meetings. These meetings were our lungs. Here we breathed. We needed to christen an organization, a leader. I didn't know these people. Abernathy was my only friend. We baptized ourselves the Montgomery Improvement Association, a name as good as any other, better than one that sounded too much like their white citizen councils. They were named for terror. We were named for resurrection. Then it was me. Put the new guy out there. He hasn't been beaten by them yet. He has a degree of distance that will throw them for a bit. My only real qualification, I didn't yet know the density of the human fist. This event repeated itself, unfortunately, many times in Dr. King's life. He writes in Stride Toward Freedom, "The nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him." Inheritance. That angry voice on the phone was once someone's dearest baby, a most promising little boy who said, "Listen, N-word, we've taken all we want from you. Before next week, you'll be sorry you ever came to Montgomery." This beautiful little boy, smiling, giggling, today sings out a hatred he has learned, a song his country handed him. His hate and fear are not really his. He inherited them. He took them into himself without knowing how gruesome they would taste, how they would sicken him too. I cannot hate him for inheriting this. I will not destroy him just because someone taught him to destroy me. Also in Montgomery, after one of those late night phone calls, Dr. King remembered this. Midnight. I've always been here, in this midnight kitchen, in this midnight city, in this midnight life. I've always known this is when the strength comes, in this midnight country, in my midnight throat, from this midnight God. Dr. King begins the second book he writes, Why We Can't Wait, reflecting on a scene in Harlem, a boy sitting on a stoop in Harlem and a girl sitting on a front porch in rural Alabama. Why We Can't Wait, the book really tells the stories of the severe violence that was 1963. And this poem is titled 1963 after Langston Hughes. You'll recognize some of these constructions. 1. A boy sits on his stoop. The house leans, hopeless as he is. The rats love him and his family. They know him. He has nowhere to go. He has nowhere to be. He dreams of nowhere. When he wakes after dreams of nowhere, he goes nowhere. His school forgets him. He forgets him. His parents work, but their exhaustion forgets him too. Is he a dream? Has his country deferred him? Can nowhere explode? 2. A girl sits on her stoop, the wood of her home, older than her grandmother, but not as sturdy. The field where her parents work is thirsty as she is, but not as angry. She sits and remembers school, but learns now in a field because debts are loud. They shout more fury than books. 3, this is the year young people will sing fury in a melody that hurts, in a rhythm that burns, a flame so hot, fire hoses shove these singers against walls, but those hoses and their water, their judges, their county clerks, their governor, and their country cannot extinguish anything. We sometimes imagine Dr. King was this superhero, sort of did everything on his own, which of course nobody does anything on their own, least of all him, and he would never have wanted people to remember that. One of his friends from all the way from Montgomery through Memphis, Ralph Abernathy, before he went to jail, before they both went to jail, when he would write letter from Birmingham jail in Birmingham, he asked Ralph Abernathy, would you be willing to get arrested? And this was Good Friday, knowing that meant they wouldn't be in their pulpits on Easter Sunday. Martin King speaks of Ralph Abernathy. I knew what he would say before I asked him, but asking is my religion. He shook his head and smiled like he always does. He spoke in the language of brother, in the dialect of love. He knew the buoyancy of a decision made. He knew I did too. Once you say it, the doing is easier. Once you do it, your body floats into prayer. We hardly know each other. Sometimes it seems we hardly know each other. The same cross floats above their church. The same Savior does the same saving. But they make prudence a grand virtue when prudence is a good little virtue. Like they have all the time in the world. Like they can afford to wait. Not when 4 girls die at Sunday school. Not when a boy's bicycle becomes his cross. Just outside of Birmingham, Dr. King's brother, A.D. King's house was bombed. My brother's keeper. I am, of course, my brother's keeper. I've always been my brother's keeper. We have always been our brother's keepers. His home is our home. The bomb on his porch is the bomb on our porch. The men who leave the bomb in the darkness, they are ours too. In learning the history of the 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, in which 4 little girls were killed and dozens of people were injured, a history that poetry can help to revive, I discovered, others had discovered it too, but not many. 2 Black boys were also killed in Birmingham that same day. One shot in the back by police, and one, a 13-year-old boy, Virgil Ware, shot by 2 white boys on a bicycle. This is Our Lady of Sorrows Comes to Birmingham too, for Virgil Ware. A boy on his bike should be out of bounds, dreaming of his paper route, admiring his big brother, smiling till his cheek turns. His mother waited for him, doted on him, treated him like the little one he was. This moment, a wound riding by on a motorbike would break her too. She would stand beside this cross and stare at what their fear does. She would breathe without wanting to. She would open her arms to receive the altar of his limp body. She would raise him to the God who did not protect him. She would hiss through her bruised teeth, "This is my body given up for you." The fact of contact. When you can sit face to face, when you can live house to house, when you can study desk by desk, when you see that it is just us, when we look into the eyes of those we fear, when we listen to the stories of those we think we know, then we begin the work of not killing each other. Perhaps the strongest counterpoint to the oversimplification of Dr. King's I Have a Dream is his really searing cultural critique that he referred to as the giant triplets, or the three triplets, his critique of racism, militarism, and consumerism, materialism. The giant triplets. 1, there are diseases that kill. They do not live in our DNA. They are not the result of a crippled gene. These toxins come from outside us. They exist. They make their way in. We sometimes act like we don't see them. That is one of their symptoms. 2, racism. Skin and color, seeing and not seeing. This skin disease has roots in the tribe. Once we might have needed to fear those who did not look like us. Today it is a blindness we cannot see. Today we've built countries on this fear. We breathe it in from just after birth. It takes humility to name it, push it away. 3, materialism. It is as simple as this. Do you think there is enough? Or do you think there is not enough? Our answer creates our creed. It is as simple as this. 4, militarism. It is not just a willingness to kill. It is the willingness to build a kingdom of killing. To not feed your children because a faster missile is delicious. To not care for your elder because we are grateful to a more powerful Humvee. This is what kills. Creating weapons in every part of the country, linking jobs to death, so no one says no. 5, these triplets should have been killed at birth, but they weren't. They were allowed to live. Now they ravage the house. The mountaintop, reflecting on Dr. King's speech the night before he's killed, April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis. An exhaustion rests on my skin like sweat. Tonight, I am afire with this truth. I and we are one. Whether I see certain victory does not matter anymore. Whether my children see it is all that matters. That the children of Memphis see it is enough. Tonight I am alive with this comfort. I can let it all go. The worst fear will eventually come true. I will not know its day and time until it is here. Even then, I might not know it. Tonight I am released with this glory. My own eyes have seen it. I am at peace with this terror. Epilogue 1. When his body is carried through the streets in a wooden wagon older than his father, when his children look on his lifeless skin with curious grief, when his widow's face waits in stillness, knowing every day from now on can be a bullet. 2, like the many who killed him, he too knew Jesus. But his life prepared his hands for the silk of wood. He readied his palms for the kiss of nails. He knew more than knowing can say. He bled more than blood. 3, most days memory is the enemy, but no one wants a memory. We want the touch, the real man. One day memory is all that remains. We will all burn down to its truth. 4, he knew memory wedded to time makes possible. He knew memory loved into the future can crush a bullet into sand. He knew this was not hope or magic. He knew memory burned into tomorrow is not a certainty, Every moment waits to be used, and using time carefully is our why. Using time with love is our revolution. This is how we raise him. This is how we rise. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Those poems hit really differently. I've recently returned from a trip to Montgomery, and you can feel the memory there. There's a part of me that wants to say, and now for something completely different. But I think one of the things that public memory allows us to do is to see these poets in conversation. So let me introduce you to Steven. Steven Leyva was born in New Orleans and raised in Houston. His poetry has appeared in numerous reviews and books, including the Best American Poetry of 2020. He's the author of the Understudies Handbook, which he'll read from tonight, which won the Gene Feldman Poetry Prize from the Washington Writers Publishing House. He has an MFA from the University of Baltimore, where he's my colleague in the Klein Family School of Communications Design. In Steven's work, he brings us back to moments where we encountered public and popular culture, parts of our collective lives, in museums and by watching TV like Star Trek and Star Wars. And he invites us to remember who we were and what was happening in our lives, both individual and collective, as we watched and listened. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you all so much for having me. I am excited to share some of these poems with you all. And to think about performance, I think anything that performs language on the page forces us to remember. And you might think, what are the things we remember? Well, one of the things we remember is that language is limited, but we don't know where those limits are. And I think one thing poetry does is try to figure that out, right? Very Star Trek, right? Strange New Worlds. I wanted to start with this poem called Immemorial, which is on brand for our poetry as public memory. Immemorial. I can't decide which is more unforgiving, history or memory. Neither is a quicksand, neither is a sea. I've erased a line that begins, I can't remember. So often, it's breathing palimpsest, being whispered awake by whatever lashes of dawn refuse to blink or self-flagellate. Lovers' names return and fade like a cold sore. The mid-Atlantic coast curled into an abandoned smile. The seagulls writing an epitaph in excrement above the coral headstones bleached. New Orleans always a sentence away, always cheating the cyclopses of myth each summer. The National Weather Service incessantly renaming like some automaton atom. Stay awake is the hum of the mud. I can't decide which catfish is frying, history or memory in the skillet. So I was going to start with some poems from the Understudies Handbook, and I thought it appropriate to start with a poem about Freddie Gray, who you all may know from the uprising that happened in Baltimore due to his treatment by the police and his death. And one of the things that I encountered was realizing that it's very difficult sometimes to put words in the mouth of someone you didn't know well, but you know through public memory. We know through the places that we encounter them. And one way that I tried to get at it was to put him in conversation with someone fictional, someone also unjustly imprisoned and unjustly treated, and that's Edmond Dantes from the Count of Monte Cristo. So this is Edmond Dantes drinks grappa, which is kind of like moonshine, with Freddie Gray. And it sort of imagines them in the afterlife. There's an epigraph. All human wisdom is contained in these two words, wait and hope. Alexander Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo. You know what I want on my gravestone? Only the dead leave the Chateau d'If. I'd leave my sons a ritual of self-portraits, the Monte Cristo gold lining their teeth, done year by year at the cemetery. Mared, if these sons weren't wisps of wasted grappa pooling in a mind's cracked flask, we need a gallows humor for the presumed dead. I'd have the reaper wearing the new clothes of the emperor, naked as the coroner's slab after a body salute. And you, for your sons, you'd leave them what? A hashtag? A sneaker's ash from burning off at first sight? Come, I can't even sleep in a bed anymore. You went to the hospital, I went to the sea. Only the dead leave the Chateau d'If. Here's to the privilege of shooting a breeze. Here's to sons that are only a breeze. You know, I didn't scream for Mercedes as much as you think. Let's line up the shots, one for every minute in leg irons. And let's see, one for your spine, one for my destitute father whose hungry belly and broken heart hung him from the rafters of despair. Certainly one for that dear sister of yours who must forever speak your full name to strangers. She will never see the Isle of Elba or the Catalans as you do now, ghosting the world through t-shirts and picket signs. So one of the things that the book tries to tackle is just how much television I watched growing up as a kid. And one of the TV shows that I watched with my mother was Star Trek: The Next Generation. And it wasn't until that I was older that I realized one of the reasons we were always watching Star Trek: The Next Generation is because Patrick Stewart was the only white man that my mother was like, damn fine. And so I wanted to write a poem for Patrick Stewart. He's one of my favorite actors. And every time I tried to write the poem, my mother insisted on being in the poem. So eventually I just let her. This is Ode to Patrick Stewart, snatched by Mama. And it's one way I think that we can consider pop culture as a time capsule, a way that we remember and then return to remembering, syndication as memory. There are two acronyms in this. TNG is the Next Generation, RSC is the Royal Shakespeare Company. All right. Ode to Patrick Stewart, snatched by Mama. Playing captain on TNG, you brought sexy back to balding. Or so my mother said, half smacking her lips on Jean-Luc. Easy on brown eyes that never loved white men before. All those roles in the RSC prepped to sit on the set. Roddenberryan throne leathered in late 80s tan. Among your stage credits, nobility caught in a photo negative stage production, Othello, gray temples fully shaved, black face rubbed out the imaginary cast list, dark love calling back the days when you lived in my living room TV. Making mulattoes in my mother's mind. And true, she doesn't even know that name, her Desdemona fantasy, but she could pull it off, pull down the world stage as easily as she has done this before, having bowed before in one Minnesota courthouse near Mankato State, newly pregnant, newly married. With you, she could do this as quickly as she has taken over this ode. Sir Patrick Stewart, the one of my memory. Way back when two TVs could stack on each other, alternative shelves. You were loved, not wisely, but too well. And just to complete the matrix of nerddom, here's a poem about Star Wars and about my favorite character in Star Wars, Lando Calrissian. Ode to Lando Calrissian. If you were stunting in a galaxy far, far away, blue cape, suave with a gold lining that would shame the sun, with a cool walk and a gambler hustle. If you had a hairstyle so fresh, you'd claim to have won it off an out-of-work Cloud City cosmetologist. If even your eyebrows had scoundrel in their arch. If everybody knew the music bumped cargo hold to cockpit in the Millennium Falcon, a name straight out of P-Funk. If everyone could see those hands churning the dark dreams of stars into the buttermilk of a hip brother running his own city. If we asked, Where are all the Black people in the galaxy? Would you help us? Would you bet on us? Part of the last half of the book, there's a section that is called Leaving the Panopticon. And a panopticon is just a word for a circular prison. And the poems in that section all deal with taking my daughter and my son to the Baltimore Museum of Art. So they're all ekphrastic poems. And one of the things that these poems, if I can do this, oh, there we go. One of these poems, many of the poems try to write about this image by Robin Road, a photograph in an exhibit that was on display when I was taking my children to see the Baltimore Museum of Art. And I tried to write as many poems as I could about the same image. So I'm going to read that sequence here for you all. And normally I would say, hey, you can pull this up on your phone, but it's here live and in color, or black and white, as it were. Walking the Panopticon after Robin Road. The scrape of my father's unshaven face was my first love. Because of questions my daughter asks while walking through the museum. Is that you? Daddy, is that you? All the men in photographs with skin the color of wet wood queried. I was mimicked bone, sickle, a ringing ear under glass that hears when I don't answer, guarding the silence like Cerberus. We pause, latched to a leash of dust, before this ear, brown as filet powder. My reflections smudge the archival glass. I look back. She looks back. My father is light as mango flesh. She leans on that light like a sail. The inner ear. Something for your poetry, no? Carolyn Forche, the Colonel. Forget listening. Consider each ear's cartography, its width of cartilage and lobe, curled dragons guarding the skull's flanks, taut skin of hidden drums. Once a friend lodged a green M&M inside one. She dreamed a cockroach would crawl in after, plant flags in the new world, measure by measure. What's the medical term for memory loss? Once my brother was bathed by a neighbor. He couldn't speak for a week. I heard the water stop running. I can't remember his face. Whose? What? Whose? I wasn't listening. The dark room. Alone at the coat check, handing over the family's London fog and North faces, I say enough. Calipers couldn't unscrew enough to measure my son's naked smile when I ask about Sumaya, the darkest child in his class. He's only 6, but turns his face from mine to smile wider. It's not what you think. A guilt lingers on my eyelashes. He is only 6, and already he's been told he's not Black. This vice unscrews like calipers until the tips touch me an ochre, a bone still dressed in gristle, and him an ambrotype before the flash, the exposed opaque parts relatively light. Am I a fool to think that smile my son can't show means he already loves, but it took me years to love? I wish for a mirror. Would it be enough if his pleasure could hold like balsam resin? If he could learn early which hands come to develop photographs of their own horrors and which come to wade in the waters of a dark room with tenderness, and how the sun shudders so slow, whatever moves in us is blurred. Indentured figure. I'd kill for a set of teeth, whale, wolf, or sloth. I'd overlap them, make a hideous maw and bite the walls behind me. I want a smile that says threat. I want a smile that speaks easy, a smile like a bluff, like refugees down a sea cliff. My eyes have grown metal pincers to measure the distances between corks of hate. I can't shut them. Why else would I face this wall? I wear a hat made of white stone. It's heavy and stinks of bird shit. My neck is wrapped in a stranger's scarf. I bear it. Below my shoulders, I'm as thin as an eyelash. Every toenail refuses to stop growing. They curl and laugh at me from inside the wall of my body. I can't leave. I can't eat. I'll make meat out of anything, even the air. Molar. Leaving the panopticon. My father doesn't know this about me, but he will. The reason I draw with both hands, the reason I forced myself to whistle, is for the fun of not knowing what to call myself. Every day in our black box of a car, we play a game. He calls a name. I say white or black, sometimes brown. He repeats whatever I say. What I don't say is larger than what I do. When the museum closes and those docent statues walk home, I sneak back and unhook all the photographs from the eggshell walls. I spit on the hooks just to be close. My father won't care, like the men under glass care. They pronounce my name by naming colors. All right, so I wanted to end that with thinking about maybe the most indelible public memory, place, and moment for me, which is a middle school dance. maybe you'll remember the particular awkwardness of middle school and middle school dances, but this is a poem that tries to capture that and many other things. And it's called When I Feel a Whoop Coming On, for the Feast of Whitsuntide and after school dances. Ain't the butterfly, it's the Tootsie Roll. The speaker's pose is a polemic against your narrow hips. This circles musk, classmates grinding like black pepper in a cheap mill, uneven, coarse. Shamelessly, you practice outside the arc of polo shirts, crop tops, and starchy jeans, sharp enough to cut penumbras from 8th graders. Summon an adolescent faith to push past the girl who laid her tongue in your mouth like a lisp on a field trip to the zoo right in front of the rhino exhibit. Your lonely Afro-Latino blood bids the center of height, ooh, in funk to be filled with your inheritance. Flat feet, a skinny boy's sense of rhythm, and a soft uptown fade. Go boy, go, you've only heard in church. This dance is different than the Holy Ghost shout filling half an hour on Sunday. Nothing like the body rock of your father's bachata he'd pull out to prove men with flat asses could dance. Still, you press and press, throw your knees like bolos, catch up to the DJ's scratch in time for the song to switch choruses, boys to men. Don't wait till the water runs dry. Those violins still weep for the awkward slow drags you'll soon try, but there's a 2-second panoply where you've imitated the other boys in their non-buttered fly and their roll too sweet. There, at least, a hip moment of locomotion where no one could charge you with a lack of blackness. To the left, to the right, more flame than Pentecost, eyes like 2 upper rooms, Holy Ghosted, your body becoming a tongue spoken. Thank you all so much.
Hopefully that, can you also hear me okay? That hopefully called up communities and lots of memories and places and all of that. So we want to hear from you all, but I'm going to exercise flex my moderator privilege and ask the first question of our poets today. We rhetoricians love metaphors, and so maybe that's something we all have in common. So my question, I suppose, is based on a metaphor, but why use the past in your poet's toolbox? Why is the past a tool you've chosen to use? One can envision, for example, a poetry collection through direct change in our lives today using more recent events, or in Steven's case, a poem that calls up pop culture that we've been watching this year. What does the past allow you to access?
Well, you know, to quote Faulkner, the past is the past. Right? It's sort of always with us in a way that is palpable and informing kind of what our imagination does. And so I always think about like what is the sandbox that is formed by the imagination that we play in with language. When we get passes out of in that sandbox. It's the past that forms the past is sort of both kind of like omnipresent and atemporal, because it helps to imagine the future. So not to be all up here with this, but it also just frankly, like I can remember the past. I can only imagine the future. And it's in that intersection. So for me, it has to do with that. What forms the sandbox in it? Words about the past.
Well, I think the reason we explore the past seems to me clear that it's because that's how the present gets created, which means that's how the future gets created. If we only, to use the examples I talked about from Dr. King, if we only imagine him having said, I have a dream, and it would be great if we also get along, some very, sort of innocuous, substanceless nothing, will never really build the world that actually confronts racism and consumerism and militarism. So I think we have to spend time in the past, but in the accurate past. And everything is not up for grabs. Everything is not debatable. You only wrote. And you can choose to just focus on that dream. And because that's, and I'm quite sure the reason that we focus on that is because it's very palatable to white people. We have to look at the past carefully, honestly. Say a little bit more about this later, but I mean, and I really feel this strongly for you as artists, you as some of you as poets, but all of you as artists. You are becoming artists in a world, in a moment of immense suffering. And we have to take every tool we can to work on this, to make the present and the future more just and more humane. And if we just pick the easy stuff out of the past, that's how we got to the place where we think American history is a bedtime story. But you should be able to sleep after it. Because we believed nonsense. As I often say to my students, no professor and no teacher in my education ever said the names of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Public memory didn't require.
Yes, it's interesting too. I had an experience with a dear friend who was saying, I think in response to the Watchmen HBO show, oh, Steven, do you know about all these books about the Tulsa race massacre? And as well-meaning as she was, I said, yes, I do. I know this history well because it's a parallel issue that is being talked about very openly. I also went to college, and so it wasn't a secret. I was infectious in some ways that, oh, everybody kind of knows. And I was like, oh, this was all black people talking about this. It just wasn't discussed at all. So I think, the way that Dr. Keohane was saying that the past is the great work of artists, right?
Or we don't.
Or we do not. Yes, yeah.
No, excellent point. I was also thinking about the past as a way to resurrect a collective sense, like as you were saying, like to be in a middle school auditorium, we remember the stories we talk about pain, and so there's sort of a collective thing to have been speaking about this. What questions do you have for our poets? I'm going to repeat them just so that since I have a microphone and so the folks on Zoom can hear, but I should be able to hear. But what questions do you have? Yeah.
Do you think using the past as a stronger impact? Does that even?
Yeah, does the past have a stronger impact than the present in poetry?
Sometimes I think it can, simply because we have developed a relationship with certain past things. And And so we feel about them. And so if somebody really plumbs into something from the past that we know and feel strong about, incorporating our feelings. If somebody pushes against what we have a relationship to in the past, that can shake us up more than something that happened last year that we haven't thought about. I think that's part of it. I don't think poets or any artists should limit themselves to only accept looking at the past. It's a way. But the past can be a powerful thing because we have relationships.
I think that I agree with what Joseph said that, on principle, I'd be hesitant to say there's something prescriptive that we should be following in terms of what we write about. But if we acknowledge that the past, by its very nature, gives us a greater degree of reflection, if you believe that reflection has a role in art making, then they're not equal, right? Just literally, right? You had more time to reflect on something, which for me always means that most more time. Right? So before these poems ever were written by hand, which happened here, they were happening here in reflection, right? The writing was already going on in my body, to say it. And I have learned just in my own process, which I wouldn't project and say that it should be about writing else. In my own process, if I don't allow that time here, what comes out on the page is just rife with what I think other people should be thinking, or what I want them to think about me. And so in all of that, what's obscured is that I can't see myself. I can't actually see what I feel. I can't actually see that, what the situation is. But, I say all that to say, but like Richard Hugo sort of says, keep your bullshit detector on high, because there's definitely been times when something has directly happened, I sat down that time, I wrote it, and just let it rock, but if I'm being honest, there's fewer than give time.
I appreciate the reflections that you both are sharing and the writer's process as a form of creating these poems as well. So I would welcome questions along those lines as well, since I know we are in the company of other artists and writers as well. What else were you wondering as you were hearing these poems or thinking about public? Yeah.
Whenever you don't have anything to rely on in the past, what causes your soul to burn with passion to create more poetry when there's lack of motivation?
What causes your soul to burn when you're struggling for motivation and when you run out of inspiration from the past?
It's impossible because, well, for me, because of library, right? The past, I can't exhaust it. I can never. I'm so inspired by other writing more than I'm inspired by like particular events, or things I think poems should be written about. My primary source of inspiration is always the language. I definitely come from a particular position that when we write about all these sorts of things, different kinds of content, the true subject of every poem is language. It's actually just a performance of language, it's a theater, proscenium on the page of language. And so, by that premise, unless I had an infinite life, I could never exhaust the past. Because gosh, I'm always behind what I think. I'm a great literature that I should have already read. I can never catch up, but that's also a joy, right? It can't exhaust it. There's always something to discover, not God, that's helpful. So, I know that seems like a dodge, but I just say that to say, I have to always refrain what can be the source of my inspiration. If I get myopic about what can be inspiring to me, then I'm going to fall sad. It's often the moment where I know, go read something from the 17th century that's fiction that's not used to hear it to get you out of that. So,
Yeah, I think it's a really this is a dodge. I think it's own it. Yeah, it's a very important thing I think for artists to know and to try to really dig in to get us honest about what really does is the initial prompting or urging, whatever is the word, for whether it's for for a poem, for a painting, for a sculpture, for an installation, for whatever it might be, for a game, some piece of digital art. What really is the initial thing. Because I think I have kidded myself fooled myself about what the initial thing is. And for me, it's not usually language. So maybe it's different from Steven's. Because for me, the language is already giving voice to something that's underneath. So I usually think this is true, that that my poems begin with some kind of a feeling, some kind of emotional response. And then I think it's probably fair to say that the language then is a way that I'm expressing it, obviously, and even the subjects, which might have nothing to do with me explicitly, are really expressing my a feeling or an internal emotion that I've had. Does that make a little bit of sense? I mean, why a book about King? And I think that's, for me, that's a complicated question, but I think it comes out of an experience of alienation, it comes out of an experience of admiration for somebody who could put alienation and a desire for community in a legal and American and cultural landscape into language. Dr. King did that. Yeah, maybe that feels less scary.
It sort of made me, I was thinking, as we think about the past as a source of inspiration, one of the lines in your epilogue, I believe, just that every moment waits to be used. So maybe there's a sense in which we can't, as you mentioned, Stephen, exhaust the past. Moments are laying in wait for us to remember them, or to, as you said earlier, Stephen, return to remember them, which is often the kind of jobs in us.
Well, yeah, and that line, that idea is Dr. King's, and the language is mine. But one of his ideas that really always sort of rattles in a good way, I think, my students and maybe anybody who carefully in jail, especially, is this idea that he really attacks those who suggest that somehow things just get better with time. He says that's just nonsense. I mean, time is neutral. Time just passes. It doesn't make anything good or bad happen. But that we who live in time, we make choices and we work hard to make terrible things happen or to make beautiful things happen. And it's up to us, to do those things. And I think that's very much in line with these ideas about how we create public memory. And I'm going to keep going back to this, but why I'm just burning these days, last couple of years. Because artists, we cannot sit on our hands, y'all. We cannot. We are living in a world where, immigrants are rushing by the hundreds of thousands everywhere. Black people are under assault everywhere in this country. Trans people are under assault everywhere. And we can, and I could go that way. We cannot, Langston Hughes wrote, books you write about snowflakes and sunrises, most of the very early lives. We don't have time to do that.
Yeah, we must act. We just like to do that grabbing hold of agency. And it's one of those things that I think, in the effort to do that too, I think it's balanced by us also imagining what resistance can be. So what I often tell my students is, don't forget to write the poems that you would if the world were just. Because if you cannot write those poems too, then there's a strange way in which you may be making art that depends on suffering, that depends on an unjust world to prompt you. And that feels terrible, so in the effort for us to act to make the world right, we have to do and imagine, I think, quite expansively, the way King might have done, a way that Mandela might have thought about rainbow nation. Those things are part and parcel two sides of the same coin. It doesn't have to be attacked at the same time. It's very, very difficult. Because one be real, not everybody pays you the same. You know, depending on what kind of partner those two impulses. And it's, you know, it's the work, right?
Like thinking about art as an intentional intervention in public memory. That's beautiful and powerful. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Like just public past, for me personally, trying to express like past culture is very hard. It's hard to write words to formulate it, but sometimes like I don't know, like it's like is it easier to express how you feel about the past culture or just talking conversation?
Yeah, what do you think? Is poetry maybe easier or more natural to talk about the past for you all?
It isn't for me. If you, maybe it's that I'm loquacious, but if you ask me to tell me something about your childhood, I would talk for 20 minutes without stopping.
And we'd enjoy it.
Yeah.
I learned a lot more and I needed to drive up here.
Oh, zing. But I think it's because I don't often view a poem as an expression of. I don't think of the poem as a container for an expression or a feeling. Right? It's something that transforms. And Carl Shapiro said that the first responsibility of a poet and an artist is to transform experience, to make it more real. He goes on with it and says like, hey, artists and poets, they take an experience or something to live, they bring it closer to the earth. And philosophers abstract it into a real. So I'm always thinking about that, it's a transformational act. And so it's not easy as work, you know, it's a lot of work, but it's not because I can't find the words. It's because it's the same work that the carpenter has to do to the table, so it's level, someone can use it, someone can interact with it. It has to develop your eye, your sense, in the relationship that you do with materials. But it's always a transformational act.
And I would just say, if you're in that struggle with finding the right words, I think that's kind of the that's the good thing. It doesn't always feel like joy in the moment, but I think frequently it does. I think, right? Or else you wouldn't be writing poems. Right? I mean, I think you can know the sweat of trying to find the right Andre or even the right shadow in a painting. It's own translations of other kinds of art, but that's I think there is joy. That is the joy of being in that struggle. So I don't know if it's easier. I mean, it's easier for me to write a poem about something than an essay.
Yeah.
I like thinking about sort of recognizing that poetry is work and that resistance is work and that ideas don't just come down to you and express them as sort of the prophet or the vessel. And that again, these interventions in memory and history are intentional and crafted by the artists to transform an audience. I'm going to just share one closing thought with y'all and then turn it over to our two speakers to share their closing thoughts based on our conversation. And I've been sort of delighted to think about, in addition to public memory as a topic, sort of the artist's work as an intervener in public memory. But the rhetoricians that I would like to talk about memory places as having this recalcitrant presentness, right? They're just there and they don't go away. But in some ways they do though, right? Because rocks crumble, inscriptions fade. And as the example of Confederate statues indicates as well, they can be removed and changed. And so I think there's a sense in which the work of the artist in writing and poetry recognizes that words can outlast some of the stone, even as we always break into poems fresh. So closing thoughts from our panelists.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of monument making that happens in the art. If I say two roads diverge in yellow wood, already, right? Already, it's just either you're groaning saying God, high school, or you're like, Frost, my dude, or whatever it might be, right? But there's a monument of language just sitting among us, right? It's not really invisible, it's almost tangible. But I think that's a great responsibility to think of. If it's gonna last, if it cannot last the stones, what you would want to last. It's a conversation I have with my students who are grad students who are often in such a hurry to be artists, live as artists, and say, as I think many of us know, those of us who have grew up with who have been continuing to observe social media, maybe it's okay to take your time and not have everything in the ether forever. Some monuments, just like some totems, need to be torn down. And if you're willing to do that in search of a greater, more responsible art that could become public, I think it's something that could take your whole life.
Requires humility, perhaps, as we think about our own language of us.
Yeah, and I can't help but say a couple things to a room full of artists and in the context of an art school. I just want to encourage you, especially those of you who are students and for those of you who are on the faculty here too. I really want to thank you for doing what you're doing. The world is in, you've heard me already, this the world is in desperate need of beauty and in desperate and even greater need of transformation. And if you're going to be artists in this, or you are artists in this, the world needs you so badly, however, isolated or frustrated, or I don't know how successful or unsuccessful you feel, or all the ways you might judge yourself. We all probably need to silence that voice, or those voices in some ways. But you are terribly important. The world is hanging on you. The world is waiting for you and your art. And the question that I have been sort of haunted with lately has to do with this, and I wonder if it might be useful for you. I don't mean to be harsh, but it's maybe the simplest way I can craft the question is to say, who will your art serve? Who will your art serve? I have to ask myself that all the time. Because there's that question, the answer to that question has both an opening and a closing. Because choices are like that, obviously. Your art can't serve everyone. But please know how badly we need you. The beauty you will create, the provocation that you offer us, we need all the movements of all.
Yeah.
Keep doing it.
Yeah, just to add something real quickly to that. There is, to the question of how much art is needed, the answer is always and there's one of my favorite lines by the poet, he ends a poem called Sea Grapes by saying the classics can console, but not enough. We need more art because, as great as they are, the classics can console, but it's not enough. I think you're right, thinking about who and what your art serves is how you enter into that. Not enough. So do it for me.
Thank you for those thoughts. I hope they're inspiring and you're all going to go write furiously. But I just want to take a second and say thank you all for coming. Thanks to the Pennsylvania College of Art and Design for having us. We really enjoyed this conversation and pushing us to think about public memory as the work of the artist and how that sort of interfaces with the challenges and the inspirations you all already have as artists. It's been rewarding and illuminating for us too. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for having us. Very inspired.
I'm gonna be that artist that hustles. Let's just be an example. Stephen and I have books to sell. Hustle is no shame. No shame.